On the 27th of September of 1980, fishermen went to fish for some trout and some amberjack off of Bayou Sail Road in the Sweetwater Pond, which is a part of the Terrebonne Swamp in Cocodrie, Louisiana to be exact. The fish are not what they found. These fishermen stumbled upon the remains of a Caucasian female. Now, crab, crawfish, and other crustaceous life had been feeding off of these remains as it laid partially submerged in the water. After finding the body, they ran to the closest gas station and then they rang the police. Now, the reporting detective on the case noticed that there were signs of her being bound. Also, there was a white scarf with a nylon cord tied around her neck that was attached to a cinder block. At first glance, they have absolutely no idea who this woman is, or who this woman could be, until they find one key detail that gives them the slightest insight. This detail is a single white dove earring. Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, and today we're going to be discussing the death of Edith McLeroy West. This case I actually watched on I watched previously, and I was really kind of like, this is interesting. Now when I watched it, it wasn't solved, but this case has been solved. I bet you're wondering exactly why this little white dove earring is so important. Well, this small detail is something that the detective had seen before, and it gave them a lead that she was associated with a biker gang in some way. When the autopsy was performed on this Jane Doe's body, it was determined that cause of death was attributed to the nylon cord, so strangulation was a key factor, but ultimately the official cause of death was that of drowning. There was not a sign of sexual activity or sexual assault on her body, and no other indication of who this might be or what else happened to her. The police then end up trying to ask questions of local biker gangs in the area, but this proves to be a dud. Most wouldn't cooperate or answer any questions, which, I mean, I don't expect them to, because here comes some cops talking to a biker gang. Now that they've hit another brick wall in this case, they have nowhere really to go. Now, because this was in the 80s, specifically 1980, the forensics was not up to par or advanced. So what the coroner did was cut off one of her hands. No, I'm not kidding. And they sent it to the FBI so they could run a fingerprint analysis. Almost immediately, there was a match. This match was to 23-year-old Edith McLeroy West, and the fingerprints that were matched were that of her arrest for public intoxication a couple of months prior. But when she was arrested, she was in Cullman, Alabama, which was about 500 miles away. This confuses officers because how exactly did she end up in Cocodrie? To find out exactly what ended up happening or how she ended up there, let's kind of backtrack and talk about Edith a little bit. Now, Cullman, Alabama is a very small, pious, religious town. The McLeroy family was very devout and very in the church. And the church was absolutely everything to this family. They were very strict, and everybody abided by the rules. Well, as a teenager, most people kind of rebel. That's exactly what Edith did. When she entered her teen years, that's when she started experimenting. And she started sneaking out at night, and she would never say where she was going. This really started escalating when she turned 16. What do girls do when they're 16? They like to sneak out, they like to hang out with boys, and they like to experiment with things. It's gonna happen. So she was rebelling as a teenager, and her father and her stepmom didn't really know what to do. It eventually became too much for her father and her stepmom, so they sent her to live at the preacher's group home. Now, this preacher's group home in town was there for teens that had a hard time. They couldn't adhere to the rules. That's really what this group home was for. But that didn't change a thing. If anything, she just rebelled more from the tight schedule she was on, the needing to help out around the group home. She just rebelled more. And eventually she got kicked out, and she wouldn't return back to her parents' home. Now, it wouldn't be until her 17th birthday in which she would go back home. But to her parents' dismay, she wasn't alone. When Edith went into her parents' house, her stepmother noticed there was a man standing by a motorcycle outside the house. This was her boyfriend, Archie Possum West, a 21-year-old unemployed biker. Now, the biker life was something that she became very a part of when she was sneaking out. And ultimately, this session met Archie. Edith wouldn't stay home with her step-parents, and she left to be with Archie. The biker life was something that really became a part of Edith. Archie was the leader of this nomadic biker gang that Edith became a part of. They would move in together, and Edith absolutely loved everything about her new life and how outlandish it was. She didn't have to follow anybody's rules. She could be her own person. She couldn't be molded into what everybody else wanted her to be, which was something she hadn't had before. Hence why people rebel. Now, they soon would marry, Edith and Archie, and they would go back to her parents' house. This is so she could inform them that they got married. This was only for about a few minutes, and then she left again. This would be one of the last times that Edith would see her parents, and that they would see her alive. One of the last times. She just wanted to inform them that they were getting married, or they got married, and she was moving out of state. Now, Archie's gang was going to move to Houma, Louisiana. They were going to be making a lot of money there. The whole gang moved down to Houma, Louisiana, and they would end up hanging around a man named Mike Brown in Houma, specifically his mechanic shop. So they could fix their bikes, they could hang out, kind of, you know what, work there, you know what I mean? Most of the bikers in the gang ended up finding jobs in Houma, but unfortunately for Archie and Edith, they ended up leaving Houma in the spring of 1980, so they weren't there for very long. Edith did work part-time. She did work as bartender, and this is so she could afford necessities. Archie would start assuming a life in petty crimes, like little petty crimes. And Edith was not fond of this whatsoever. And she tried to call her parents, but every time she did, Archie would stop her. At one point, Edith did return home to Cullman, Alabama, and this was in the summer of 1980. And this was around the same time that she was arrested. When she returned home, she told her parents what she had done and that she was done with the lifestyle and how her and Archie were always on the run. In August of 1980, Edith didn't return to Archie after she ran away. Her arrest for public intoxication in Cullman is because her stepmother called the cops on her. She was tired of seeing her daughter that way. So after she was arrested, obviously we got her fingerprints, but we'll kind of go into what happened after she went arrested in just a second. So after she was identified, they find out she was married to Archie, and that was her connection to a biker gang. So the detectives then try to find Archie, but he isn't in Houma, Cocodrie, or in Cullman. So in October of 1980, they then find her estranged husband, Archie. Now, Archie has been in New Orleans, and he's been incarcerated on burglary charges, and he's been there since the beginning of August of 1980. So it's kind of obvious that Archie had an ironclad alibi for this. When they asked him, Archie told the officers that he hadn't heard from Edith and didn't know where she was. And the cops then asked if anybody would want to hurt either Edith or him, and that's when he gave the names Ricky Brown, Michael Burnett, Randy Buccalow, and James Hines. These men in particular rode with Archie and knew of the relationship that he had with Edith. They were also very good friends. With the names of these 4 men in tow, they started investigating them. They also make sure that Edith's case is heavily covered around town. Now, this is a tactic to get more intel into the case. They did, in fact, help the detectives to get a lead to a trailer in West Houma. This is where the 4 men indeed lived. Now, when investigators made their way out to the trailer, they asked questions about Edith, and all of the men stated that they last saw Edith on September 22nd of 1980. This was about 5 days prior to her being found. They also went on to tell the detectives that Edith showed up for her stuff, but her stuff was in Archie's truck. And because Archie wasn't there, they didn't have approval to let Edith into his truck. So they just partied that night. Edith crashed after Michael left to go back home to Alabama for a court date, and Ricky Brown left. Randy and James would leave the next morning because they had to go to work, but when they returned, Edith wasn't there. So shortly after they were being questioned, the detectives would come back to the trailer, but all of them were gone. Would you expect anything less? And after this would leave the detectives in yet another standstill. This case would go cold for months after her body was found, and it would remain cold for years. So in early 2000, Carol, Edith's stepmom, receives a very disturbing phone call from a woman who says she knew who killed Carol and that her sister Vicki Brown knew something. Carol then told the woman to call the Louisiana police about Vicki Brown and the murder. Now it's unclear whether or not she actually called the police. Vicki Brown was married to Ricky Brown, of who was a member of Archie's biker gang. The detectives then try to find where Vicki is, but ultimately they find out that she still lived a transient type of lifestyle. In 2001, another phone call comes in, and this is in regards to the murder itself. This call is from the attorney of Mike Brown, the mechanic shop owner. You know, the shop of which the bikers would hang out. They would fix their bikes and stuff like that. Well, he was also a friend of Archie's gang. He was facing drug charges when he called, or when his attorney called. And basically what happened during this conversation is Mike delved into the details that Ricky Brown told him about Edith's murder. This conversation happened on the way down to Florida, apparently, and police then, after they got off the phone with Mike Brown's attorney, they then try to find Ricky and Vicki Brown. But yet again, they hit another brick wall. Not until 2010, this is 30 years after the death of Edith McLeroy West, a Terrebonne detective reopened the murder case and starts to look into Archie West. He is now deceased. Michael Burnett. He is now deceased. He then searches for Ricky and Vicki. He finds a number for Vicki. She's residing in Kentucky. After he rings this number, they have about a 3-hour conversation on the phone. And this is when Vicki goes into the details about what happened. Vicki and Ricky started dating the day that Edith returned. And Vicki also spilled the beans on everything. September 22nd of 1980, Edith drinks with the guys. She then starts to, loosen up, and she says that she snitched on Archie. If you don't know loyalty among bikers, or loyalty among anybody, if you snitch on somebody, you're dead. Well, on the morning of September 23rd, Michael and Ricky wake Edith. They beat her, strip her of her clothing, tie her up, and throw her in the trunk of his car. They then bring her to a spot on the pond that is off of Bayou Sail Road. They tie the nylon cord around her neck, and then they attach to the cinder block. Ricky thought they were only going to scare her, but Michael apparently decided that they had to kill her. There was no other way. So they tie the cinder block to the nylon cord, and then they throw that in the water. Now apparently Edith tried to make it out of the water, but eventually stopped, and she started praying. She started praying because she knew she was going to die, and she felt that this was the only way that she could be at peace before this happens. Ricky apparently felt bad during this attack, and he tried to save her, but Michael stopped him. Michael kind of threw him out of the way. Michael then proceeds to strangle Edith and puts her back in the water. This story was corroborated with the phone call back in 2001 with Michael Brown and his attorney. Detectives then, after they hear all this, they decide to look for Ricky Brown. And they ultimately track him down. It's somewhere where you don't think he would be. They track him down because of his traffic citations. Ricky Brown was arrested in Cullman, Alabama, where Edith is from. He was arrested first for his traffic citations, then he was charged with second-degree murder in February of 2012. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. That, my friends, is the death of Edith McLeroy West. A very tragic death for a young woman who just didn't know. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe, turn your bell notification on to all, and leave a comment down below. Tell me about cases you want me to cover for Spooktober, which that's coming. And I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in my next one.